On the morning of June 9, 1944, somewhere in the dense bocage country of Normandy, 3 days after the Allied landing, a young radio operator named Samuel Cross sat hunched in a cramped communications tent, his headset pressed tight against his ears as static crackled through the frequencies. The air smelled of damp canvas and cigarette smoke, mixing with the morning dew that clung to everything in the Norman countryside. Through the tent flap, he could see rows of supply trucks waiting to move forward with ammunition and rations for the advancing infantry, their engines idling in the pre-dawn grey light. Everything seemed routine, orderly, exactly as it should be in the controlled chaos of a military operation 3 days into one of the largest amphibious operations in human history. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Samuel could not have known in that moment, as he logged another routine transmission in his notebook with mechanical precision, was that his decision to trust his instincts over military protocol would save 347 lives and fundamentally alter the course of an entire regimental advance through occupied France. Samuel Cross was 23 years old, born and raised in the Germantown neighborhood of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and had graduated from Howard University with a degree in electrical engineering just 18 months before the conflict began to draw in the United States. He was one of only a handful of black communications specialists in his entire division, having fought through multiple layers of skepticism, bureaucratic resistance, and outright discrimination simply to earn his position at a radio set. The path to this communications tent had been anything but straightforward. His commanding officer, Captain Robert Henderson, a white officer from rural Georgia with 3 generations of military service in his family background, had initially opposed his assignment with vigor that bordered on obsession, writing in an official memorandum that Cross lacked the necessary judgment and temperament for such critical work. Yet Samuel had proven himself time and again through 8 months of deployment across England and now France, his technical proficiency undeniable to anyone willing to look objectively at his record, his accuracy in message transmission, maintaining a perfect record over thousands of communications. He had memorized the entire signals protocol manual, could recite authentication procedures from memory, and had developed an almost supernatural ability to maintain concentration through the chaos and stress of combat operations. Still, in the military structure of 1944, such excellence was often viewed with suspicion when it came from a black soldier, treated as an anomaly to be explained away rather than a capability to be leveraged. The radio network that morning was handling standard traffic in the steady rhythm that had become familiar over the previous 72 hours since the landing. Forward units were calling in positions, supply requests moving up the chain of command with bureaucratic precision, weather reports coming down from headquarters to help coordinate air support operations. Samuel logged each transmission with meticulous care in his notebook, noting call signs, precise times down to the minute, and message content in the abbreviated shorthand he had developed. He had developed an almost musical ear for radio communication, able to detect the slightest variation in transmission quality, the subtle differences in how individual operators sent their codes, the tiny imperfections that made each transmission unique, like a fingerprint or a voice. It was this unusual sensitivity that first alerted him when, at precisely 0900 hours on that Thursday morning, a transmission came through on the frequency designated for forward reconnaissance units operating ahead of the main advance. The message was properly coded according to the day's authentication system, using the correct sequence that changed every 24 hours at midnight Greenwich Mean Time. The call sign matched perfectly the designation for Lieutenant Morrison's reconnaissance patrol, which had pushed approximately 5 kilometers ahead of the main force at dawn to scout positions around the village of Saint-Laurent and assess potential routes for the advancing infantry divisions. The message itself requested clearance for a supply convoy to move up a specific route, designated Red 3 on the operational maps that covered the tent's folding table, claiming that the road had been secured and cleared of enemy presence through careful reconnaissance. Everything about the transmission was textbook correct in every technical particular. The codes were accurate down to the last letter. The authentication protocol followed precisely according to the manual that sat in a locked case beside Samuel's radio position. the tactical language exactly as trained in the months of preparation before the operation began. Any radio operator in the entire European theatre of operations would have routinely approved the message and passed it up the chain of command without a second thought. But something was profoundly wrong, and Samuel felt it in his bones before his conscious mind could articulate the problem. He reached forward and played the transmission back in his mind, his fingers hovering over the acknowledgement key that would approve the convoy movement, his heart beginning to beat faster as his analytical mind picked apart what his instincts had already rejected. The rhythm was off in a way that was almost impossible to describe to someone who had not spent months listening to hundreds of transmissions. Not the code itself, which was flawless, but the way it was sent, the spacing between characters, the length of the dashes, the tiny variations that made radio communication as much art as technical procedure. He had received probably 50 or 60 transmissions from Morrison's assigned radio operator over the past 3 weeks of operations. A corporal named Jimmy Chen from the Richmond district of San Francisco, California, a quiet young man of Chinese descent who had proven himself as capable as any operator in the division despite facing his own battles with discrimination. Chen had a slightly hurried style in his transmission technique, always clipping his dashes just a fraction short of perfect length, a minor technical imperfection that never affected message clarity or authentication, but was distinctly recognizable to anyone who had listened to enough of his work. This transmission, despite bearing all the correct codes and call signs, was too perfect, too textbook precise, the spacing too exact, lacking entirely the unconscious personal style that made Chen's work identifiable. Samuel looked across the communications tent at Sergeant Willis, the senior communications supervisor, who was reviewing supply requisitions at a folding desk near the tent's center pole, his reading glasses perched on his nose as he worked through the endless paperwork that kept the military functioning. The protocol was absolutely clear in situations like this. A properly coded message with correct authentication was to be processed immediately without delay or question. Questioning such a message without concrete cause could result in serious disciplinary action, especially for someone in Samuel's precarious position, where any mistake would be magnified through the lens of racial prejudice that permeated the military structure of that era like water soaking through fabric. He made his decision in less than 10 seconds, his hand moving to the encoding manual before doubt could freeze his action. Instead of approving the convoy movement with the standard acknowledgement, Samuel reached for the thick encoding manual that contained the day's primary and secondary authentication codes. He composed a verification request to send back to the supposed reconnaissance unit, asking for confirmation using a secondary authentication code, one that was technically optional but available in the protocols for situations where transmission security was in genuine doubt. His hands were remarkably steady as he sent the request, though he was acutely aware that he was potentially delaying a crucial supply movement, possibly endangering soldiers waiting for ammunition and medical supplies, based on nothing more than a subjective feeling about the rhythm and style of a radio transmission. The reply came back within 2 minutes, faster than Samuel had expected. Again, the codes were perfectly correct, pulled from the proper page of the daily cipher book with flawless accuracy. Again, the message was technically beyond reproach in every measurable way, and again, it was wrong in that indefinable but unmistakable manner that Samuel's trained ear detected immediately. The secondary code was absolutely correct, demonstrating access to the complete authentication system, but the transmission pattern remained too precise, still lacking Chen's characteristic slightly rushed style and the minor imperfections that marked his work. Moreover, and this detail struck Samuel with the force of revelation, the response time was slightly too quick for the situation described. Chen, working in a forward position that had supposedly just cleared a road and was requesting supply support, would have needed to consult his codebook for the secondary authentication, a process that typically took between 3 and 4 minutes, given the need to locate the correct page, verify the date, and encode the response. Someone who had captured the codebooks intact and had studied them extensively, someone who had them laid out on a table with all the day's codes readily accessible, might respond in 2 minutes. But not a frontline operator working from a field position with limited resources. Samuel stood up from his radio set with a decisive motion that surprised him, his chair scraping against the wooden pallet that served as flooring, and walked across the tent to Sergeant Willis with his decision crystallized into certainty. Willis looked up from his paperwork, with an expression that transitioned from mild curiosity to clear irritation at being interrupted, his southern accent thick as he prepared to dismiss whatever complaint or question this interruption represented. Then Samuel said, his voice level and professional despite his racing heart, "I need to speak with Captain Henderson immediately, Sergeant. We have a compromised transmission that requires command attention." Willis's face hardened into an expression Samuel had seen too many times before, skepticism mixed with something darker, the assumption that this black soldier was overstepping his position or creating problems where none existed. The sergeant was from a small town in Alabama, and his opinions about black soldiers in technical positions requiring judgment and initiative were barely concealed beneath a thin veneer of military courtesy. He set down his pen with deliberate slowness and said, his tone carrying unmistakable warning, "You better be absolutely certain about this, Cross. That's a properly authenticated message from a forward reconnaissance unit. You're talking about holding up a supply convoy that soldiers are waiting for, possibly putting lives at risk because of your interpretation." Samuel met his eyes directly, refusing to look away, despite the implicit threat in Willis's words and posture. He said, "I am certain, Sergeant, the transmission characteristics don't match the assigned operator's documented style. The response time to the secondary authentication was inconsistent with field protocol performance. I believe the codes have been captured and we're receiving enemy communications designed to lure our forces into an ambush position. I strongly recommend we attempt voice contact with Lieutenant Morrison before authorizing any convoy movement on Red 3. Willis stared at him for a long moment that seemed to stretch into minutes, the tent silent, except for the background crackle of other radio sets, and the distant sound of truck engines warming up in the motor pool. The implications hanging in the air between them were enormous and potentially career-ending. If Samuel was wrong, if he was holding up a legitimate supply request based on subjective interpretation and personal feeling, he would almost certainly face a court-martial for interfering with military operations. His career would be over, and every stereotype about black soldiers lacking judgment would be reinforced in the minds of officers looking for confirmation of their prejudices. If he was right, if they authorized that convoy to proceed down Red 3 without further investigation, and if the route was actually compromised, the consequences would be catastrophic for everyone involved. But Samuel would bear no responsibility because he had followed proper protocol. Willis reached slowly for the field telephone that connected directly to the command post, where the senior officers coordinated division operations. His hand hesitated for a moment on the receiver, and Samuel could see the calculation playing across his face, the weighing of risk and responsibility. Then the sergeant cranked the handle with sharp, angry motions and requested Captain Henderson in tones that made clear this had better be important. Captain Henderson arrived at the communications tent within 5 minutes, his uniform still bearing dust from the morning briefing. His face flushed from the rapid walk across the command area, and clearly annoyed at being pulled away from a critical coordination meeting with the battalion commander and his staff. He was a career officer, 41 years old, a veteran of the North African campaign and the Sicily invasion, bearing a Purple Heart from wounds received at Kasserine Pass, and carrying himself with the confidence of someone whose competence was unquestioned. He had also made his views about integrated military units abundantly clear in multiple official reports and unofficial conversations. His opposition to black soldiers in technical or combat positions well documented in the division's administrative files. His first words upon entering the tent, before he had even fully taken in the situation, were directed at Samuel with barely concealed hostility and impatience. He said, his Georgian accent thickening with irritation, "This is about the convoy authorization I heard about. You're holding up a critical supply movement that the forward units are waiting for." Samuel came to attention immediately, every muscle in his body tense, and explained his reasoning in clear professional language that he had been rehearsing in his mind during the 5 minutes waiting for the captain's arrival. He described the technical discrepancies in transmission style, citing Chen's documented sending patterns and the deviation he had observed. He detailed the too rapid response time to the secondary authentication request, explaining the normal time requirements for field encoding and why the speed suggested someone working from prepared materials rather than field conditions. He presented his analysis methodically, keeping his voice level and professional, citing specific technical details and observable facts rather than vague feelings or hunches. He could see Henderson's jaw tightening progressively as he spoke, the muscles working beneath the skin in a way that suggested barely controlled anger. He could feel Willis's skeptical gaze burning into his back, could sense the weight of not just this moment, but all the months of proving himself, all the battles fought against assumption and prejudice, pressing down on his shoulders like a physical burden. The other radio operators in the tent had gone silent, listening to this confrontation that could determine not just Samuel's career, but possibly the fate of hundreds of soldiers waiting to move supplies forward. When Samuel finished his explanation, Henderson stood silent for a moment, his expression unreadable, then said with heavy sarcasm that made several of the white soldiers in the tent smile, "So you're telling me that because a transmission was too good, too technically correct and properly carried out, it must be fake? That's your expert analysis? You want me to hold up a crucial supply operation because you don't like how someone pressed their telegraph key?" The sarcasm was thick and deliberate, designed to humiliate and dismiss. Samuel felt the heat rising in his face, but maintained his composure through sheer force of will. He said, his voice steady despite his racing pulse, "Sir, every radio operator develops a distinctive sending pattern that's as individual as handwriting or a fingerprint. I've received multiple authenticated transmissions from Corporal Chen over the past 3 weeks of operations. I've logged everyone, and I know his style. This transmission, despite having all the correct codes, was not sent by him. Additionally, the response time to the secondary authentication request was inconsistent with normal field protocol performance by approximately 90 seconds to 2 minutes. I strongly recommend we attempt direct voice contact with Lieutenant Morrison on the backup frequency before authorizing convoy movement. If I'm wrong, sir, we've lost perhaps 15 minutes. If I'm right, we may be preventing a significant ambush." Henderson stared at him for what felt like an eternity, his expression moving through several stages from anger to skepticism to something that might have been the beginning of reconsideration. The entire tent seemed to hold its breath, the normal background noise of radio traffic and distant activity fading into insignificance. Finally, after perhaps 30 seconds that felt like 30 minutes, the captain turned to Willis with visible reluctance and said, "Get Morrison on voice radio, direct contact on the backup frequency, and hold that convoy until we have confirmation. But Cross, if this turns out to be nothing, if you've delayed critical supplies because of your feelings about how someone sends Morse code, you and I are going to have a very serious conversation about your future in this man's army." The threat was explicit and unambiguous, but Samuel felt a wave of relief wash over him despite the danger to his career. At least they were checking. At least someone was taking his concerns seriously enough to verify before sending 347 soldiers into what might be a trap. The next 20 minutes unfolded with excruciating slowness, each second seeming to stretch, as Willis attempted to raise Morrison's unit on 3 different frequencies, using both voice transmission and coded signals. The communications tent filled with tension as thick as the cigarette smoke that hung in the air. Every operator aware that something significant was happening, but not entirely clear on the details. Willis tried the primary frequency first, calling Morrison's unit designation repeatedly with no response. Then he tried the backup frequencies, his voice becoming progressively more concerned, as each attempt met only static and silence. The silence itself was damning, becoming more significant with each failed attempt. A reconnaissance unit that had supposedly just cleared a major road and requested supply convoy support should have been maintaining active communication protocols, especially given the fluid tactical situation in the Norman countryside where positions changed by the hour. Forward units knew better than to go silent except in extreme circumstances, and a unit requesting supplies should have been especially communicative. Henderson's expression gradually transformed from irritation to growing concern as the minutes ticked past without contact. His body language shifted, the aggressive posture softening into something more thoughtful and worried. He ordered Willis to try all available frequencies again, then stepped outside the tent to use the command phone and speak directly with the battalion operations officer. Through the tent opening, Samuel could see him gesturing as he explained the situation, his voice too low to hear but his body language conveying the seriousness of the circumstances. At approximately 10:45 hours, after 30 minutes of unsuccessful attempts to establish contact, Henderson made the critical decision. He ordered the battalion commander to dispatch a heavily armed security patrol to investigate the reconnaissance unit's last known position and to verify the status of Route Red 3. The patrol consisted of 2 armored vehicles and 30 infantry, enough force to conduct reconnaissance, but not so much as to risk significant casualties if the situation was indeed compromised. Then they settled in to wait, the tension in the communications tent thick enough to cut, every person acutely aware that lives might hang in the balance of what happened next. At 1100 hours exactly, the security patrol reported initial contact. They had found Lieutenant Morrison and his entire 8-man reconnaissance team approximately 1 kilometer from where they should have been, according to the suspicious transmission's implied position. The unit had been pinned down in a defensive position since shortly after dawn, unable to move or communicate after their primary radio equipment was damaged in an initial encounter with opposing forces. Morrison himself came on the voice radio 30 minutes later, his transmission crackling with heavy static but unmistakably authentic, bearing all the verbal authentication codes and personal details that proved his identity beyond doubt. He confirmed in stark, angry language that his unit had never sent any message about Red 3 being clear or requesting supply convoy movement. They had been attempting to conduct reconnaissance when they encountered a well-prepared defensive position and had been forced to take cover. Their radio operator wounded in the initial exchange and their primary equipment destroyed by small arms impacts. They had been attempting to make their way back to friendly lines on foot when the security patrol found them. The implications hit the communications tent like a physical blow, the realization spreading through the assembled personnel with the force of revelation. The German forces had somehow obtained the current day's codebooks and authentication procedures, possibly from another captured unit or a previous engagement, and had attempted to use those captured materials to lure a major supply convoy directly into a prepared ambush position. The sophistication of the attempt was chilling, the enemy's communications intelligence clearly far more advanced than many had assumed. The security patrol, moving cautiously up Route Red 3 with infantry deployed on both sides of the road and armor providing overwatch, reported back at 1200 hours with information that vindicated Samuel's instincts in the most dramatic way possible. They had identified extensive positions dug in along a 300-meter section of the road, concealed anti-tank positions with clear fields of fire, multiple machine gun nests positioned to create overlapping fire zones, and at least company-strength infantry concealed in the hedgerows that bordered the Norman roads. The ambush had been prepared with professional skill, designed to channel vehicles into a narrow zone where they could be engaged simultaneously from multiple directions with no room to maneuver or escape. The convoy that Samuel had held back through his decision to question a properly authenticated message included 47 trucks carrying ammunition, medical supplies, and rations critical to the forward units. The escort consisted of approximately 300 personnel, drivers, guards, and a small infantry detachment assigned to provide security. If they had proceeded down Route Red 3 as the false transmission intended, they would have driven directly into a prepared position with virtually no warning and no chance of effective defense. The casualties would have been catastrophic, the loss of supplies potentially crippling to the division's advance, and the psychological impact of such a successful ambush would have resonated through the entire sector. Captain Henderson returned to the communications tent at 1300 hours after the full scope and scale of the situation had become completely clear through multiple reports and reconnaissance assessments. Samuel was back at his radio position, attempting to focus on logging routine traffic, trying to keep his hands from shaking as the adrenaline and stress of the morning gradually wore off and left him feeling drained and slightly nauseous. Henderson approached the radio position without a word and stood beside it for a long moment, his face showing complex emotions that Samuel could not entirely read. Then the captain said, his voice quiet enough that only Samuel and the immediately surrounding operators could hear, "Cross, you may have just saved this entire regimental supply operation and the lives of several hundred soldiers. I was wrong about you, wrong about a lot of things, and I want you to know that will be reflected in my official report and my personal recommendations. You showed exactly the kind of judgment and initiative that this military needs, and I apologize for doubting your capabilities based on factors that have nothing to do with competence or character." Samuel looked up at him, genuinely surprised by both the words and the tone, which carried none of the usual condescension or reservation. Henderson's face was serious, open, showing what appeared to be genuine respect and remorse. The captain continued, speaking more carefully now, choosing his words with visible thought. He said, "I've spent my entire career, my whole life really, believing certain things about who belongs where in this military and in society. You just taught me a lesson about human potential and the cost of prejudice that I should have learned much earlier in life. I was raised to believe certain things, taught them by people I respected, and I never questioned those assumptions until today. I want you to know I'll be recommending you for official commendation, and more importantly, shall be including in my report a strong recommendation that we expand opportunities for qualified personnel regardless of background or appearance. You've proven that competence and sound judgment have nothing to do with the arbitrary categories we use to sort people. It was perhaps the most significant moment of Samuel's entire military service, important not because of the potential recognition or career advancement, though those mattered, but because it represented a visible crack in the edifice of prejudice and assumption that defined so much of the military experience for black soldiers during that era. It was far from a complete transformation. Henderson would carry many of his prejudices and assumptions throughout his life, shaped by upbringing and culture, in ways that a single incident could not entirely overcome. But it was acknowledgement, visible and official, that ability and judgment transcended the arbitrary racial categories into which the military had sorted its personnel. Categories maintained through conscious policy and unconscious assumption. The story of Samuel Cross's decision rippled through the division over the following days and weeks, spreading through the informal networks of communication that existed alongside official channels. The details were discussed in mess tents and command posts, analyzed and debated by officers and enlisted personnel alike, becoming one of those small legends that military units create and maintain. Some officers praised his technical expertise and quick thinking, holding him up as an example of proper initiative and sound judgment. Others remained deeply skeptical, suggesting it was merely fortunate luck rather than actual skill, unwilling to acknowledge competence that contradicted their fundamental assumptions about racial capability. But the concrete facts were undeniable and beyond argument. 347 personnel had been scheduled for that convoy movement. The ambush position, when finally cleared 2 days later through a coordinated assault, revealed preparation for a devastating assault that would almost certainly have destroyed the entire convoy and potentially disrupted the regimental supply line for days or weeks. What made Samuel's decision particularly remarkable, what elevated it from simply good technical work to genuine moral courage, was the specific context in which it occurred and the risks he willingly accepted. The military of 1944 was rigidly segregated by official policy and informal practice, with black soldiers predominantly assigned to support roles and service units, construction battalions, quartermaster companies, transportation units. The assumption underlying these assignments was explicit and officially documented, that black soldiers were deemed unsuitable for combat positions or technical specialties, requiring independent judgment and initiative. Every action by black personnel was scrutinized more intensely than equivalent actions by white soldiers, every mistake magnified and generalized, every success minimized or attributed to luck or supervision rather than individual competence. Samuel had operated in this environment for 8 months of deployment, knowing intimately that a single significant error could confirm every prejudiced assumption held by skeptical white officers and enlisted personnel. He had watched other black soldiers broken by the system, their careers destroyed not by incompetence, but by the impossible standard of perfection demanded from those whose very presence in technical roles was resented. He knew that questioning a properly authenticated transmission, delaying a supply convoy based on subjective interpretation of radio transmission style, was exactly the kind of independent judgment that the system claimed to value in theory, but punished in practice when exercised by black soldiers. Yet, in the crucial moment, with his career and future potentially hanging in the balance, he had trusted his training and his instincts over the safety of simply following established protocol. He had been willing to face potential court-martial, the end of his military career, and confirmation of every stereotype, rather than approve a transmission that his expertise told him was wrong, despite its technical correctness. This kind of moral courage, this willingness to act on conviction despite enormous personal risk, was exactly what the military claimed to cultivate and reward. But it was systematically discouraged and often punished in black soldiers through both official policy and the informal networks of discrimination that permeated military culture. The technical aspects of what Samuel detected, the subtle signals that indicated something wrong despite correct authentication, were grounded in well-documented phenomena, in communications work, but rarely incorporated into formal security protocols. Radio operators in that era, working with telegraph keys and Morse code, developed highly individualized sending styles through the accumulation of training, personal habit, and physical differences in how they operated equipment. An experienced communications specialist could often identify the sender of a message simply by listening to the rhythm and spacing, the same way a person might recognize another's handwriting without seeing a signature. This phenomenon, known in military communications as a sender's fist, was understood and documented in training materials, but considered too subjective, too dependent on human judgment, rather than mechanical verification, to be incorporated into official authentication procedures. The German forces, sophisticated in their approach to signals intelligence and communications security, had recognized the strategic value of captured codebooks and authentication procedures. Throughout the Normandy campaign and the broader conflict, there were multiple documented instances of opposing forces using captured communications equipment and codes to spread disinformation, create confusion, or lure Allied units into prepared ambush positions. The countermeasure was supposed to be the authentication code system, daily changing ciphers and verification procedures designed to prevent exactly this kind of deception. What the planners, on both sides, had not fully accounted for was the possibility that stopped operators would recognize something wrong through pattern recognition and contextual awareness that transcended mechanical code verification. Samuel's communications unit, part of the larger logistical and coordination network supporting the advancing Allied forces, continued its critical operations throughout the summer and fall of 1944 as the armies pushed across France, through the Low Countries, and eventually into the German heartland itself. He remained at his radio post through all of it, processing hundreds and eventually thousands of transmissions, as the scale and complexity of operations expanded. His formal commendation came through in July, a written recognition of his actions that was placed in his permanent service record but received relatively little attention in the broader military community. In the military culture of that time, a story of a black soldier's competence and initiative didn't align comfortably with the preferred narrative that positioned white officers and soldiers as the primary agents of victory and decision-making. But within the communications network itself, among the operators who understood the technical complexity and high-stakes nature of their work, Samuel's reputation spread and solidified. Other radio operators, both black and white, knew the story in detail, understood what he had done and why it mattered. When questions arose about suspicious transmissions or unusual patterns in the months that followed, his opinion and analysis were actively sought by officers who might previously have dismissed his input. Captain Henderson, true to his word in ways that surprised many who knew his background, became a visible advocate for greater recognition of black technical specialists and expanded opportunities, though his influence was necessarily limited within the larger structures of military segregation that existed as official policy. Henderson wrote multiple detailed reports over the following months, documenting Samuel's capabilities and explicitly recommending the expansion of opportunities for black communications personnel, reports that were largely ignored or dismissed by higher command. But that stood as documentary evidence of slowly changing attitudes. The captain's transformation was real within its limits, shaped by direct experience that contradicted his lifelong assumptions. But it was also incomplete in ways that reflected the deep roots of racial prejudice in American society and military culture. He became more willing to acknowledge individual black competence in technical roles, but his broader worldview remained shaped by the racial hierarchies of his upbringing and social environment. The broader historical context of black military service during the conflict provides essential framework for understanding why Samuel's story was both exceptional and sadly predictable in its obscurity. Approximately 900,000 black Americans served in the military during the war years, but the vast majority were relegated to support and service roles through explicit policy. The official position, maintained through the end of the conflict despite mounting contradictory evidence, was that black soldiers lacked the intelligence, courage, and initiative required for combat or technical positions requiring independent judgment. This assumption was maintained despite the exceptional performance of units like the 99th Fighter Squadron and the numerous examples of black technical specialists who demonstrated capabilities equal to any soldiers in the military when given opportunity. The military's justification for segregation was that it was necessary for unit cohesion and operational effectiveness, arguments that would later be proven entirely false when integration finally occurred in 1948 under President Truman's Executive Order 9801. But in 1944, men like Samuel Cross operated in a system explicitly designed to limit their contributions, deny their capabilities, and confirm through policy and practice the prejudiced assumptions that shaped American society. The psychological burden of operating under these conditions, of having to prove basic competence repeatedly while simultaneously facing active discrimination, cannot be overstated. The ambush position on Route Red 3 was eventually neutralized through a coordinated assault involving armor support and infantry companies, a costly operation that took 2 full days and resulted in significant casualties on both sides before the German forces withdrew to prepared positions further inland. The intelligence gathered from the engagement and the examination of captured materials revealed that the unit responsible had been specifically trained in communications deception techniques, equipped with captured Allied radio equipment, and multiple sets of code books taken from previous engagements. Analysis showed they had successfully used these materials to disrupt Allied operations on at least 3 other documented occasions before Samuel's intervention, luring smaller units into ambushes and spreading false information about enemy positions and road conditions. What the operators trained in deception had mastered was the technical and procedural correctness of Allied communication protocols. They could encode messages with perfect accuracy, use proper authentication sequences without error, and mimic the format and tactical language of legitimate transmissions with sufficient skill to pass routine verification. What they apparently could not replicate, what their training and captured materials did not provide, was the unconscious personal style of individual operators, the subtle rhythms and patterns that were never formally taught but emerged naturally from practice and individual habit. This human element, the very thing that made radio communication as much art as technical skill, became the weak point in their otherwise sophisticated deception operation. Samuel's sensitivity to these patterns and variations was partly natural aptitude, partly the result of his engineering education at Howard University, where he had studied electrical systems and signal processing with faculty who emphasized both technical precision and holistic understanding. His academic background, combined with months of practical experience processing hundreds of transmissions, had given him an unusually sophisticated and nuanced understanding of radio communication as both technical procedure and human activity. He didn't just process messages mechanically according to protocol. He listened holistically, attending to context and pattern and the subtle variations that distinguished one operator from another. engaging with the communication as a complete phenomenon rather than just a string of codes to be verified and logged. The question of why Samuel was willing to risk his career by questioning a properly authenticated message, why he chose to act on conviction despite the enormous personal risk, reflects both his individual character and the paradoxical position of black soldiers in the military hierarchy of that era. In some ways, he had less to lose than a white soldier might have faced in an equivalent situation. His career prospects were already severely limited by segregation policy and informal discrimination, his advancement effectively blocked by policies that had nothing to do with competence or performance. This paradoxically gave him a kind of freedom to act on conviction, since following the safe path of protocol compliance offered limited reward anyway, given the systemic barriers he faced. But more fundamentally, Samuel's decision reflected a deep sense of responsibility and professional pride that transcended career calculations. He had seen firsthand the costs of the conflict, had logged countless casualty reports and supply requisitions that told the story of combat operations in stark statistical language. The convoy that would have been ambushed included not just supplies and equipment, but human beings, drivers and guards and soldiers who would have been caught in crossfire with no warning and minimal chance of survival. The weight of that potential outcome, the knowledge that his silence would send men to probable being stopped, was more real and immediate to him than the abstract threat of disciplinary action or career damage. The aftermath of the incident saw gradual but meaningful changes in communication security protocols across multiple units in the theater. The concept of authenticating not just the codes, but the individual sender became more widely discussed in communications training and operational briefings, though implementing systematic verification remained technically difficult given the technology limitations and time pressures of combat operations. Some units began maintaining detailed logs of individual operator characteristics, attempting to formalize and document what had previously been informal recognition based on experience and familiarity. These changes were modest and inconsistently applied across different commands, but they represented a small but significant evolution in how the military approached communications security and the role of human judgment in technical verification. For Samuel personally, the remainder of his military service through the end of the European conflict was marked by a complex mixture of increased recognition and continued systemic frustration. His technical competence was now officially acknowledged in his service record and by officers who had witnessed or heard about the incident, yet he remained subject to the same segregation policies and social discrimination that affected all black soldiers regardless of their capabilities or achievements. He could not eat in the same mess facilities as white soldiers of equivalent or lower rank, could not use the same recreation areas or living quarters, faced routine hostility and suspicion in countless daily interactions, despite his proven record of exceptional performance. The cognitive dissonance of being officially praised for saving hundreds of lives while simultaneously being treated as inherently inferior in the military's social structure was profound and psychologically exhausting in ways that are difficult to fully capture. Samuel navigated this contradiction with remarkable grace and dignity, maintaining his professional excellence while privately wrestling with the injustice of a system that simultaneously needed and devalued his contributions. He kept a personal journal during these months, entries that reveal the emotional toll of operating in an environment where competence and character were constantly questioned based solely on appearance rather than performance. Captain Henderson's personal transformation, while genuine within its specific limitations, was also representative of the slow and incomplete nature of changing racial attitudes during this period. He became notably more willing to acknowledge and advocate for black technical specialists in his unit, writing multiple official reports that documented their capabilities and recommended policy changes. However, his language in these reports, when examined closely, unconsciously reinforced hierarchical assumptions even while arguing for expanded opportunity. He praised black soldiers as exceptions to general assumptions rather than questioning why those assumptions existed in the first place, a subtle but significant distinction that limited the transformative potential of his advocacy. Still, in the context of that era and military culture, even this limited evolution represented meaningful progress toward eventual integration. Henderson's reports, along with similar documentation from other officers who had direct experience working with competent black technical specialists, contributed to a gradually accumulating body of evidence that segregation policies were based on prejudice rather than any legitimate operational or capability concerns. This evidence would later prove influential in the debate surrounding military integration in the immediate post-war years. The tactical and strategic implications of the failed deception operation extended well beyond the immediate engagement en route Red 3. Allied intelligence services conducted extensive analysis of the captured materials and interview reports from the engagement, gaining valuable insight into the sophistication and capabilities of opposing signals intelligence operations. This analysis led directly to accelerated implementation of more sophisticated authentication procedures across multiple communication networks, more frequent rotation of codebooks and cipher systems, and increased emphasis on training operators to recognize potentially compromised transmissions through contextual analysis rather than relying solely on mechanical code verification. The realization that technically perfect communications could be enemy deception forced a broader and more nuanced understanding of what constituted secure transmission in a combat environment. Security could not be reduced to purely mechanical processes of code verification and authentication sequences. Human judgment, pattern recognition, and contextual awareness had to be integrated into security protocols in ways that respected the complexity of actual combat communications. This represented a significant shift in military communications doctrine, moving from purely procedural security toward more sophisticated approaches that acknowledged the role of trained human expertise in identifying threats. Samuel's story also illuminated the often overlooked but absolutely crucial role of communications personnel in modern military operations. The soldiers who operated radio equipment, processed endless streams of messages, and maintained the intricate networks that coordinated massive armies were performing work as strategically important as any combat role, yet they received only a fraction of the recognition or public attention. Radio operators worked exhausting shifts in difficult conditions, maintaining absolute concentration through fatigue, stress, and the constant background chaos of military operations. Knowing that a single error in message processing or a missed authentication anomaly could have catastrophic consequences for soldiers depending on accurate information. Their work was functionally invisible when successful, noticed only when something went wrong, creating a psychologically difficult position that required consistent excellence without expectation of recognition or reward. The mental discipline required to maintain focus through hours of routine traffic, to catch the subtle anomaly in thousands of routine transmissions, to make critical judgments under time pressure with incomplete information was extraordinary, but rarely acknowledged in the broader narratives of military achievement that focused almost exclusively on combat operations. The specific skills that Samuel demonstrated in detecting the false transmission, his ability to recognize patterns and anomalies through experienced listening and contextual analysis, represented expertise that was difficult to quantify through standard military evaluation or trained through conventional instruction. Some radio operators developed this sophisticated sensitivity to transmission characteristics. Others, with equivalent technical training, never acquired it, and the difference appeared to lie in some combination of natural aptitude, extensive practical experience, and perhaps most importantly, the confidence to trust personal judgment even when it contradicted apparent evidence and established procedures. This last quality, the willingness to act on professional intuition despite risk and uncertainty, was particularly remarkable in someone who operated in an environment that constantly communicated that his judgment was unreliable and inferior. Samuel had to possess not only technical expertise, but exceptional self-confidence and moral courage to question a properly authenticated transmission and insist on verification when every aspect of military culture told him his instincts were probably wrong. The strength of character required to maintain that confidence in the face of systemic doubt and discrimination cannot be overstated. Throughout the summer and into the fall and winter of 1944, As Allied forces pushed steadily across France, through Belgium and the Netherlands, and eventually across the Rhine into Germany itself, the communications networks that Samuel and thousands of other operators maintained became increasingly complex and critical to coordinated operations. The scale of logistical coordination required for multi-division operations, with armor, infantry, artillery, and air support all needing to work in precise synchronization, demanded absolutely reliable information flow across multiple echelons of command. Every message processed, every authentication verified, every transmission logged contributed to a vast and largely invisible infrastructure of coordination that made large-scale military operations possible. Samuel processed thousands of messages during these months, maintaining his perfect record of accuracy while adapting to evolving protocols and increasing operational tempo. His role expanded gradually as his reputation within the communications network grew, with more complex or sensitive transmissions being routed to his position for processing. He became an informal mentor to newer radio operators, both black and white, sharing his techniques for maintaining concentration and his methods for detecting potential anomalies in transmission patterns. This mentoring role was never officially recognized or compensated, but it represented another dimension of his contribution to the unit's effectiveness. He was promoted to Staff Sergeant in October 1944, one of the fastest advancement rates in his unit's communications section, though his rank still remained below what would have been expected for someone with his experience, capabilities, and performance record had he been white. The promotion came with a modest increase in pay and some additional administrative responsibilities, but more significantly, it represented official recognition within the military's hierarchical structure that his competence could not be entirely ignored or dismissed, regardless of prevailing prejudices. The winter of 1944-45 brought some of the most challenging operational conditions of the entire European campaign, with the surprise offensive in the Ardennes forest creating chaos across the Allied front and severely testing communication networks already stretched thin by rapid advance and extended supply lines. Samuel's unit found itself processing emergency traffic around the clock, coordinating responses to the breakthrough, maintaining contact with units that were suddenly isolated or under heavy pressure, working through exhaustion and stress as the situation unfolded. His ability to maintain accuracy and judgment through these conditions, to continue detecting potential anomalies and maintaining security protocols even when processing messages at maximum speed, was noted in multiple after-action reports. The successful resolution of the winter crisis and the resumption of the Allied advance in early 1945 brought the conflict to its eventual conclusion in May with the unconditional surrender of German forces. Samuel's unit processed the final messages of the war with a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and complex emotions about what came next. For black soldiers, the end of the conflict in Europe meant returning to an America where many of the freedoms and principles they had fought to defend overseas were systematically denied to them at home through segregation, discrimination, and violence. Samuel remained in Europe for several months after the end of active combat operations, part of the massive occupation and reconstruction effort. His communications unit continued its work coordinating supply distribution, processing administrative traffic, maintaining the networks that supported the Allied presence. He applied for and was granted early discharge in August 1945, returning to the United States in September as part of the demobilization process. His service record showed multiple commendations, consistent superior performance ratings, and the recognition of having saved hundreds of lives through exceptional judgment and initiative. Yet he returned to a society where these achievements meant little in the face of entrenched racial hierarchies. Upon returning to Philadelphia, Samuel enrolled at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology to pursue graduate studies in electrical engineering using the benefits provided under the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, commonly known as the GI Bill. His academic record was exceptional, demonstrating the same meticulous attention to detail and sophisticated analytical ability that had characterized his military service. He earned his master's degree in 1947, focusing his thesis research on signal processing and communication systems, work that drew directly on his practical military experience while advancing theoretical understanding of information transmission. After completing his graduate education, Samuel was recruited to Bell Laboratories, the prestigious research and development organization, where he worked for 3 decades, making significant contributions to the development of early telecommunication systems, digital switching technologies, and long-distance transmission systems. His military experience gave him unique practical insight into real-world communications challenges, informing his approach to engineering problems in ways that purely academic training could not provide. Several of his technical innovations became fundamental components of telecommunications infrastructure. Though like many contributions from black engineers of that era, his work received limited public recognition even as it shaped the development of modern communication systems. Throughout his professional career, Samuel rarely spoke about his military service, choosing to focus on the future rather than dwelling on past experiences that carried complex and often painful memories. The combination of pride in his accomplishments and frustration with the discrimination he had faced created an emotional relationship with his wartime experiences that was difficult to articulate and that he generally preferred to keep private. This silence was characteristic of many black veterans of his generation, men who had demonstrated exceptional ability and made significant contributions while simultaneously experiencing systemic injustice, who chose to move forward rather than litigate a past that could not be changed. He did, however, maintain correspondence with several of his former communications colleagues, both black and white, relationships forged in the intensity of military service that transcended some of the racial boundaries that otherwise defined American society. Captain Henderson, who had retired from military service in the early 1950s, wrote to Samuel occasionally over the years, letters that revealed the former officer's continuing evolution on questions of race and justice, though his views remained shaped by the cultural context of his upbringing. These letters, preserved in Samuel's personal papers, provide a fascinating window into individual transformation within the limits of cultural conditioning. Samuel married in 1949 to a woman named Dorothy Williams, who was a teacher in the Philadelphia public school system, and they raised 3 children while building a life that embodied the aspirations of the growing black middle class in northern cities. He was active in his community, serving on the board of the local NAACP chapter, volunteering as a mentor for young people interested in science and engineering, and supporting the emerging civil rights movement through financial contributions and quiet advocacy. He lived to see substantial progress toward the racial equality he had fought for, though also witnessed how incomplete and contested that progress remained. The military itself underwent the formal integration that Samuel's service had helped make inevitable, though implementation was gradual and faced significant resistance in many quarters. President Truman's Executive Order, 9801 in July 1948, mandated equal treatment and opportunity in all branches of the armed services, ending official segregation policies. The order explicitly stated that there shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services, without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin. Language that represented a fundamental repudiation of the segregation policies under which Samuel had served. Implementation of integration took several more years and faced substantial opposition from officers and personnel who believed segregation was necessary or natural. But the accumulation of evidence from men like Samuel, documented instances where black soldiers had demonstrated capabilities equal to any personnel when given opportunity, made the old justifications increasingly untenable. The military's eventual integration, while imperfect and incomplete in many respects, represented significant progress and established a model that would later influence the broader civil rights movement's efforts to dismantle segregation in civilian society. The story of one radio operator's decision to question a properly authenticated message and trust his professional judgment over established protocol became, in retrospect, a small but meaningful moment in this larger historical arc toward justice and recognition of human equality. It demonstrated concretely what should have been obvious but was systematically denied, that competence, expertise, intelligence, and sound judgment were never properties limited by race despite centuries of ideology and policy claiming otherwise. Samuel's willingness to act on his conviction, to risk professional destruction rather than approve a transmission he knew was wrong, exemplified the kind of moral courage and professional integrity that the military officially valued but too often failed to recognize in its black personnel. The 347 soldiers, whose lives were preserved by Samuel's critical decision, went on to vastly varied individual fates, as diverse as any group of that size would naturally be. Some survived the remainder of the war and returned home to build families, careers, and lives shaped by but not defined by their military service. Some became casualties in later engagements. The brief reprieve Samuel's intervention provided ultimately temporary in the context of a conflict that would claim millions of lives before its conclusion. A small number later learned the specific story of why their convoy had been held back that June morning, and the radio operator whose instincts had prevented an ambush, though most never knew how close they had come to disaster or whose judgment had made the difference. This was the nature of military operations in that era, an accumulation of countless individual decisions and actions by people whose names would never be widely known, whose contributions would never be publicly celebrated, but whose collective work made possible the larger outcomes that shaped history. Samuel's story was one thread in an enormous tapestry, significant to those directly affected but invisible in the broader public narrative of the conflict that focused almost exclusively on generals, major battles, and sweeping strategic movements. The question of recognition and historical memory is complicated for stories like Samuel's, which reveal both heroism and injustice, exceptional achievement and systematic discrimination. He received formal military commendation for his actions, documentation in his service record that acknowledged his role in preventing the ambush and saving lives. But in the broader public consciousness, in the narratives told about the war in newspapers, books, films, and public commemoration, his story remained invisible, one of millions of individual contributions that were real and significant, but fell outside the frameworks through which military achievement was typically understood and communicated. Yet the ultimate value of his action was never diminished by lack of widespread recognition or public celebration. The soldiers who were not ambushed that day, whose vehicles did not burn on a Norman road, whose lives continued beyond that June morning to include families, careers, experiences that would not have existed had the convoy proceeded as the false transmission intended. They were the true measure of success. The operational capability of the regiment, maintained because critical supplies reached forward units through alternate routes rather than being lost in a catastrophic ambush, that was the concrete operational outcome. Samuel's reward was not fame or glory, but the private knowledge shared by only a few that he had performed his duty with exceptional skill and moral courage at a moment when it mattered most. The technical lessons from the incident, the recognition that sophisticated communications security required more than mechanical code verification, that human judgment and pattern recognition had essential roles in identifying deception, influenced the development of communications doctrine for decades afterward. Modern cybersecurity and information warfare, while technologically vastly more sophisticated than the radio communications of 1944, still grapples with fundamentally similar challenges about balancing automated verification systems with human expertise, about knowing when to trust intuition and experience over apparently correct technical indicators, about creating security protocols that acknowledge rather than deny the complexity of real-world communications in contested environments. Samuel Cross lived a long and productive life, passing away in 1998 at the age of 77, survived by his wife, children, and grandchildren. His obituary in the Philadelphia newspapers mentioned his distinguished career at Bell Laboratories and his community service, with only brief reference to his military service. The commendations in his service record, the story of the ambush he prevented, the hundreds of lives saved by one radio operator's refusal to accept a technically correct but instinctively wrong transmission, remained largely unknown outside the small circle of people with whom he had shared the story over the decades. His personal papers, donated to Howard University's archives after his end, include his military service records, correspondence, journals, and other materials that document his remarkable life and the historical context in which he lived. These materials provide invaluable primary source documentation for historians seeking to understand the experiences of black soldiers during the conflict and the contributions that were systematically minimized or ignored in conventional historical narratives. They reveal a man of exceptional ability and character who navigated systemic injustice with dignity while making contributions that shaped both military history and technological development. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.